I think we're live. Megan, can you give me a thumbs up on? Okay, thanks so much. Uh, hey, sorry for the lag there. Little Zoom jump, and welcome to the 21st century. Hey, good day, good afternoon, maybe good morning if you're coming to us from the West. But in any case, and wherever you are, I offer you a welcome to our special conversation today, co-hosted by the Hank Center and the John Courtney Murray Chair in Public Service. Our event is called Fratelli, Tutti, a conversation addressing Pope Francis's new encyclical on human solidarity and its socio-political implications for the United States. My name is Michael Murphy, and it's my great honor to serve as director of the Hank Center. And on behalf of Ambassador Miguel Diaz, who holds the Murray Chair, and the Hank family, whose generous endowment funds our many endeavors, I extend a warm Loyola greeting. I'm also so pleased to extend a hearty welcome from our friends at Commonweal Magazine, who are also co-sponsoring this event. And I think many have published in Commonweal on this panel, if not everybody. And Carmen's recent article is a tour de force, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that very soon. In any case, we thank Commonweal for their support. I also thank all hands who made preparation for this event very light work, most especially our dedicated center staff, Center Manager Megan Toomey, our graduate student assistant Kathleen McNutt, and our undergraduate assistants who do such good work for us as well, Catherine and Francis. I remain ever grateful for their superb work. The event here is a second in a two-piece sequence that seeks to distill and amplify intersections between Pope Francis's thought, particularly in his encyclicals, not so much Lumen Fide, but Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. The genesis really for today's conversation is a grace of timing in a certain way, so many graces amidst so many challenges, as we know. But it's wonderful that Fratelli Tutti is hot off the press and has come into our midst just 10 days ago. I've been through it, not in a full way. I'm still digesting Laudato Si, to be honest with you, and I've read it many times. But we are in great position to take a very good look. The content of Fratelli Tutti is a perfect companion to Laudato Si, and it amplifies so much of what was needed to be amplified from Laudato Si, and so that's wonderful. The Irish have a saying, a bird doesn't fly on one wing, and so we have a fuller vision now of Pope Francis's beautiful vision and the expanse of it, and the precision of it too, in many ways, thanks to this letter. But don't take my word for it. We have a most excellent group that Miguel has assembled today, and I look forward to this needed conversation. So just some housekeeping before we move over to our event. And, I just want to say for the Hank Center, we have some events left in the semester. Please visit our web pages. Most of them, 3 of them are on election 2020, the Catholic vote and what have you. Coming up next on the 20th of October, we have Kathy Caveney from Boston College, Matthew Sitman from Commonweal, and Ken Woodward, formerly of Newsweek, to offer insights on Catholic Vote 2020, does it exist? But really the focus is how will faith be a factor? And then we have our Teilhard fellow, Steve Millies from CTU, offering another vision of politics and our lives together as Catholics, as people of faith, in our Teilhard lecture on October 29th. So please join us. As for today, this Zoom cast is basically a webinar, which means that we're disabling the chat function. So you're welcome to make comments and write questions, and we're tracking them, but you'll be making them to Megan as our host, and Megan will be communicating with me, and then we're gonna put them together. I'll group these and read them aloud, maybe in a sequence of 4. So our panelists at the appointed time, when Miguel thinks it's the right time, I'll share them out. So that's the extent of it. Otherwise, it's just to settle in and give a good ear to our excellent speakers, scholars, thinkers, and we again thank them for accepting our invitation. So I'm going to do a briefer bio reading so we can get going, and I begin with the great Professor M. Sean Copeland. Professor of Systematic Theology Emerita at Boston College. Sean is internationally recognized and an award-winning writer and scholar. Professor Copeland is the author and or editor of 6 books, including Knowing Christ Crucified, The Witness of African American Religious Experience, that was from 2018, and In Fleshing Freedom, Body, Race, and Being from 2010. And then there's scores of articles, book chapters, essays that Professor Copeland has written and are available for your reading. Welcome, Professor Sean Copeland. Next is John Gehring. John is the Catholic Program Director at Faith in Public Life and author of The Francis Effect, A Radical Pope's Challenge to the American Catholic Church. John's a writer, journalist, and an advocate. He has been published in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, Religion News Service, and the National Catholic Reporter. John won the prestigious 2019 Religion News Association Award for his commentary writing in Commonweal magazine. So glad you're here, John, and welcome. Carmen Nanco Fernandez is professor of Hispanic Theology and Ministry and director of the Hispanic Theology and Ministry program at Catholic Theological Union. Now, Carmen works in all kinds of areas of Catholic social teaching, interreligious, ecumenical, and intercultural relations, IM/migration, and sport and theology. She's very well known for all these areas, and her special passion as well, the intersections between faith and popular culture with baseball. Carmen's a big baseball fan, and I'm sure you've suffered greatly these last months in a different way. Carmen, welcome to our midst, my friend. Bishop John Stowe, OFM Conventual, has a Master of Divinity, a licentiate in Sacred Theology, and his field is church history, and he earned that at a shared alma mater of mine, the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley. Bishop Stowe was ordained to the priesthood at his home parish at St. Anthony in Lorain, Ohio in 1995. In 2002, Bishop John served the Diocese of El Paso as moderator of the Curia and Vicar General. And during his time in El Paso, he taught the Tepeyac Institute for Lay Ministry and was active in ecumenical and interfaith dialogue. Those were great years for Bishop John there. And in 2010, he was elected Vicar Provincial of the province of Our Lady of Consolation and became rector of the Basilica of the National Shrine of Our Lady of Consolation in Cary, Ohio. Bishop John was consecrated and installed as the 3rd Bishop of Lexington on May 5th, 2015. So welcome, Bishop John Stowe, to our gathering as well. And finally, and thanks for hanging in, but this is important to share these lauds with all of you. Miguel, Ambassador Miguel H. Diaz, professor, a colleague here at Loyola, is the John Courtney Murray University Chair in Public Service and was selected by President Barack Obama as the 9th U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See. Professor Diaz obtained his doctorate in systematic theology from the University of Notre Dame. He is a member of the Catholic Theological Society of America and a member of and former president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States. Miguel's forthcoming book is, and I don't want to get the title wrong, so I need to take a look here and forgive me. I love it. Yeah, this is it. Miguel, it's great. It remains great. The Word Became Culture. And Carmen is a fellow editor here, Carmen Nanco Fernandez, as well as Gary Ribe Estrella. And it's a wonderful book forthcoming, I think, later this year. But there's that. So Miguel, way to go on that one. And welcome one and all to our midst. I now hand it over to you, Miguel, and thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Michael, so much, and for that wonderful introduction of everyone, and also to the Hank Center, really for all the work that you have done, all the work that goes on behind the scenes that really makes possible events like this. And so my thanks to you, and of course my sincere thanks to Commonweal for sponsoring, co-sponsoring this event. And I also want to issue a word of thanks to Tom Fox, the CEO and president of NCR, And he sent an email also to the NCR readers, inviting them into this webinar. And last but not least, to all of you who are out there from different parts of the country, perhaps even across the Atlantic, who have joined us in this important conversation. I will, of course, be felt miserably if I did not express my deep gratitude to the dream panel that we have managed to assemble here today. We have oftentimes heard Pope Francis speak about dreaming and dreams. He does it in this encyclical. So I wanted to start with that image of dreaming and dreams. And Pope Francis tells us in this encyclical, Fratelli, Tutti, and I quote, "No one can face life in isolation. We need a community that supports and helps, in which we can help one another to keep looking ahead. How important it is to dream together. By ourselves, we risk seeing mirages, right? But things that are not there. Dreams, on the other hand, are built together." End of quote. So let's dream together with this dream team as we explore further the contributions of Fratelli Tutti for our country and, in fact, the world. I want to begin with just a few thoughts about, that will begin to get us into the conversation with our panelists. And so this is part of a series that I began some years ago here at Loyola, Controversial Conversations, Faith in Public Life. And the series basically engages the university community with the wider public in conversations that address the salient and often difficult, right, controversial challenges of our times. What I want to do is share a few quotes that I found particularly important that address our times. And then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to share with us around 5 minutes, something that they also found important, relevant to the times that we find ourselves in. So the first quote that I found particularly important in this encyclical is this image that the Pope has, and he really draws at different parts of this encyclical. In fact, one could even say that the entire encyclical is about tearing down walls, right? In terms of this notion of the siblings in the one family of God. And he writes, "It is the territory of the barbarian," quite strong words, "from whom we must defend ourselves at all costs. As a result, new walls are erected for self-preservation. The outside world ceases to exist and leaves only my world, to the point that others, no longer considered human beings, possessed of an inalienable dignity, become only them. Once more, we encounter the temptation to build a culture of walls, a common theme in this papacy, to raise walls in our hearts, walls in the land, in order to prevent this encounter with other cultures, with other people. And this is quite a stern warning, those who raise walls will end up as slaves within the very walls they have built. They are left without horizons, for they lack this interchange with others." On racism. Racism is a virus that quickly mutates and instead of disappearing goes into hiding and lurks in waiting. A virus. On politics. The Pope argues that charity is also civic and political. It's also civic and political. It makes itself felt every action that seeks to build a better world. Social charity, he goes on to argue, makes us effectively seek the good of all people, considered not only as individuals or private persons, but in the social dimension that unites them. charity, and I love this one, coming from the Cuban American tradition. I spoke about this theme last night at LMU with respect to Our Lady of Charity. But charity, which is the spiritual heart of politics, it's always preferential love shown to those in greatest need. It undergirds everything we do on their behalf. Pope Francis on the danger of populist leaders. Pope Francis rejects the kind of populism that allows elected officials and individuals to exploit, in his words, politically a people's culture under whatever ideological manner for their own personal advantage or continuing grip on power. Or when at other times they seek popularity by appealing to the basest and most selfish inclinations of certain sectors of the population. This becomes all the more serious, the Pope argues, when in cruder or more subtle forms, it leads to the usurpation of institutions and laws, end of quote. So, here we are, this wonderful panel that is going to dream together, and it's going to draw their own inspiration from this encyclical and relate it to the signs of our times. I am going to ask, I'm going to begin with Bishop. So I'm going to begin with Bishop Stowe, and then I'm going to turn to Dr. Sean Copeland, and then John, and then Dr. Carmen Anco Fernandez to lead us in this dreaming. And the question that I have asked them to reflect upon, and I'm going to give each of them about 5 minutes to share their thoughts, is what in Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli, Tutti do you find most compelling and relevant to the signs of our times, particularly with respect to this moment in the history of the United States of America? So with that question in mind, let me turn to Bishop Stowe.
Thank you, Ambassador Diaz, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation with such wonderful theologians and people that have helped us think about this, what this papacy means already. As a Franciscan, I continue to marvel at the Franciscan spirit of our first Jesuit Pope. There's more to his connection to Francis of Assisi than a name. Fratelli Tutti is his second encyclical to take its title and its inspiration from Francis of Assisi. But I would say that his apostolic exhortation, all of them, but especially the joy of the gospel, as well as his Aparecida-born emphasis on missionary discipleship, are so much at home with the vision of St. Francis that the adjective Franciscan can interchangeably be used to describe the movement of the 13th century saint or the current pontiff with very little distinction. Most striking in this encyclical from my perspective is the willingness to envision a different kind of politics, the theme of chapter 5. The way that the social teaching of the previous 5 popes has been shortchanged in its American reception seems to be met here with a head-on challenge in this document as Pope Francis spells out the implications of social teaching for public policy and not just in a theoretical way. The philosophical and theological underpinnings of previous social encyclicals received attention in universities, in church settings, among bishops, but it usually stopped there without engaging what this teaching might mean on how we are to be governed, what our advocacy as a church should be in a representative democracy, what it should look like, or how it should be exercised in the conscientious decision-making of individual Catholics. From William F. Buckley's Mater Si Magistra No to the heightened and almost exclusive attention to sexual morality, doctrinal orthodoxy, and affirmations of capitalism in so many neocon writers in America, the US reception of papal teaching was filtered to the point that John Paul's and Benedict's critiques of capitalism, their denunciation of wars, and even affirmations of the ecological movement were relatively unknown. By his constant attention to the peripheries and his repeated invitation to encounter, Pope Francis, I think, integrates the social teaching of the church with the dogma, with the morality, and with every other area of the church's life. I think his writing is accessible to a much larger audience, and I marvel at how he can move rather coherently from a description of the world struggling with a global pandemic without the structures to unify a global response, to an exegesis on the parable of the Good Samaritan, to a vision for creating a more open world, an invitation to open hearts to that world and simultaneously break down barriers and borders and become universal neighbors, to the practice of social friendship and its power to change politics for the common good. Chapter 5 deconstructs a current false understanding of populism to be replaced by a genuine understanding of the root of the word, people, people's cultures, people's aspirations, and the long-term basic needs that human beings need for survival. We can't create a program to meet these needs. And just as he taught us in Laudato Si that we can't find our way out of the ecological disaster with technology alone, conversion of heart, conversion of attitudes and lifestyles are needed both in the social organization and in the preservation of the planet. The marketplace will not solve the problems without attention to human dignity. But as the basis for solidarity, an all-inclusive attention to human dignity will make clear the necessity of an international order, even an international power structure, which already exists in the world of commerce, and the exercise of charity as political love, which the Pope simply illustrates with the example of the difference between an individual charitably helping an elderly person across a bridge and a politician and a political organization that constructs a bridge for many to cross. I think that Pope Francis advances Catholic social teaching by demonstrating how it is integral to the life of the church and the life of discipleship. His teaching documents weave the various components of church life together, showing their interrelatedness, just as he shows the interrelatedness of all creation in Laudato Si and the interrelatedness of all people in Fratelli, Tutti. His own teaching weaves together the various components of church life, showing their interrelatedness, and by doing so, he makes it harder to isolate social teaching as a specialized field of doctrine. I think here and in all his writings, Pope Francis reads the signs of the times and applies the gospel to what he sees and invites us to follow.
Thank you so much, Bishop Stowe, for those opening reflections which begin our dreaming. Dr. Sean Copeland.
Thank you, Ambassador Diaz, Your Excellency, for inviting me to participate in this extraordinary panel. And I'm very glad to do so. I'm very happy that we're joined by so many people, so very many people from around the world, in fact, and there are, of course, a few in the audience who are already intimidating me as they're sitting in Dublin somewhere. Those famous Irish theologians are out there. So I'm thrilled to be here. Less systematic than Bishop Stowe, but I'm very struck by the use of the horizon in such a limited way that the Pope uses it. He tries to alert us, as your slide in fact showed. We encounter the temptation, he writes, to build a culture of walls, to raise walls, walls in the heart, walls on the land, in order to prevent this encounter with other cultures, with other people. And those who raise walls will end up as slaves within the very walls they have built. They are left without horizons, for they lack this interchange with others. Horizon then is extensive, and it gives us a perspective. Without it, we are blind. we are suffering from a scotoma, if you will. And we cannot see, which means that we are steeped in a solipsism. So such a limitedness of horizon. He's warning us about this. This kind of limitation creates a civilization that is not only solipsistic, but also self-devouring. I think the other aspect which struck me, and these are some themes that I'm very interested in. The first is dreaming, that we are invited indeed to share in what I would want to identify as God's dream for us. Something, in fact, that the whole of the Paschal mystery from a liturgical, theological point of view recapitulates. And we are invited into this. The other dimension of this, these other two dimensions, and Bishop Stowe mentioned these, but I'm deeply struck by the politics, particularly at a time when politics is considered to be, the Pope calls it distasteful. It's a distasteful word. That critique captures much of the current disparaging discourse about politicians and politics. Media commentators, pundits, and talk show hosts not only deride inept and self-serving political practice, but politicians themselves deride politics. Indeed, politics strikes the average citizen, certainly in the United States, not only as a secondary and dispensable activity, but a noxious one as well. I think the punishing outbreaks of the coronavirus and the virus of racism in our country, these surges continue to teach us that politics is a primary and indispensable activity. This is precisely what the Pope is trying to demonstrate in this desire for a new kind of politics. The other dimension, and I'll want to say more about this, is the anthropology that's here. It's extensive, expansive, and inclusive. I find the basis for this politics really is what he calls the dignity conferred by God's infinite love for every man and woman. Those are his words in paragraph 85. He describes this dignity throughout as innate, inalienable, intrinsic. And the challenge for us, particularly in some of the later paragraphs, he says we cannot be indifferent to suffering. So we must be made aware of this because every human being has the right to live with dignity and to develop integrally. We cannot be indifferent to suffering. We cannot allow anyone to go through life as an outcast. Instead, the Pope writes, we should feel indignant, challenged to emerge from our comfortable isolation, to be changed by our contact with human suffering. And that is the meaning of dignity. So I found this enormously challenging and enormously comforting in a real theological way, particularly as a teacher, running a course right now for Emory University Candler School of Theology on suffering, solidarity, and the cross. So this rooting our connection in our relationship through human dignity as a gift from God was enormously comforting and inspiring to me. The other 2 points that he makes about this is the need to integrate everyone. And so he uses these 2 phrases for persons: existential foreigners. We create existential foreigners, and we exile others, our brothers and sisters, so that they become hidden exiles. We treat them, he says, as foreign bodies in society. These are all themes that I deeply resonate with. If I were perhaps a more humble person, I would certainly say that, gee, maybe the Pope ran across an article of mine in which I tried to say some of those very same things. But I hope that we're all listening. The last point I want to make in his concern for political love reminds me of the point that the philosopher Cornel West makes when he says, justice is what love looks like in public. And this is precisely what I think Pope Francis is attempting to do, to show us what love looks like in public. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Copeland, for continuing this morning's efforts to dream together. And I turn the mic over to John Gehring, who will continue to help us in this effort.
Thank you, Dr. Diaz, and it's great to be with all of you today. I'm humbled to be a part of such a distinguished panel. So many of you I've gotten to know over the years and learned from, so it's really great to be with all of you. I think for me, this encyclical is another example, and it's been said before by Bishop Stowe and Dr. Copeland, of the Pope really reading the signs of the times and offering us a very stark challenge, not only as individuals, but collectively as a society. We all know we have an election coming in a few weeks, and it's painfully clear that we need a new kind of politics that Pope Francis calls for in this document. And to me, while there's no doubt the encyclical challenges Catholics across party lines, across ideologies, I do read the Pope's sharp criticism of nationalist trends and anti-immigrant populism as really a candid critique of our president's America First agenda. On a deeper level, I would say the encyclical also calls us to ask some difficult questions about the kind of Christian nationalism that is ascendant in our politics right now in this country, but also around the world, including the Pope's own backyard in Italy. Pope Francis reminds us again and again, as Dr. Diaz said, that walls, both metaphorical and literal, are not the architecture we as Christians are called to build. A few things that really jumped out at me. Pope Francis's reflection on what it means to be a neighbor, a deep encounter and solidarity with others that really transcend border walls, skin color, and language, is really, if you think about it, the Christian radicalism at the heart of the parable of the Good Samaritan, which the Pope spends a lot of time analyzing, and we can talk more about later. So the narrow and sort of defensive bonds of nationalism are ultimately, Francis reminds us, deeply unchristian. To be a Christian, we follow Christ first, not a flag or an ideology. The cross is where we gather. And when the flag or the gun or an ideology drive us, we're ultimately worshiping false idols, as the Pope has reminded us before. Another point that jumped out to me, and I think it came early in the encyclical, and I think it jumped out because for me, it's a summation or a distillation of the Francis papacy. He says, and here he's talking about St. Francis, Francis did not wage a war of words aimed at imposing doctrines, the Pope writes. He simply spread the love of God. Throughout his papacy, we see Pope Francis has tried to rescue doctrine from being perceived as kind of a spiritless set of small-minded rules, and really reclaiming doctrine as the living love of God. And what the Pope has referred to in another setting is the freshness and fragrance of the gospel. I always think back to that first big interview with Father Spadaro when the Pope said, the church's pastoral ministry cannot be obsessed with the transmission of a disjointed multitude of doctrines. We have to find a new balance. Otherwise, even the moral edifice of the church is likely to collapse like a house of cards. I'm also struck, as others have said, about how Pope Francis clearly sees the global pandemic as a wake-up call. The radical individualism and ideology of libertarianism, he points out, is always dangerous, but particularly has deadly consequences during a global pandemic. And Francis writes that we, quote, deny reality if we don't see how, despite our virtual connectivity and closeness in online spaces, our social fragmentation makes it really hard to address global challenges. We certainly see that with the challenge of climate change. And again, the issue of politics that others have brought up. Pope Francis recognizes we need to radically rethink our politics and economic life. A global pandemic has only heightened the Pope's sense of urgency around themes that he stressed throughout his papacy. Another important theme that I was thinking about, and Bishop Stowe brought this up, and this is something that Pope Francis has written about earlier, is just his very effective dismantling of free market fundamentalism. Pope Francis won't be making any friends with Catholics who worship in the Church of Unfettered Capitalism. The marketplace, as Pope Francis writes, cannot resolve every problem, and what he starkly calls, quote, the dogma of neoliberal faith must be seen for what it is, a failure for the poor and most vulnerable. So as always, I'm grateful that Pope Francis has invited us to build bridges on interfaith dialogue, find the heart of the gospel in the peripheries, and radically rethink our political and economic life in ways that better affirm justice and human dignity.
Thank you so much, John, for those rich reflections. And now, last but certainly not least, is mi colega, my partner in crime. I invite you to soñar en conjunto with this nation thirsting for new dreams and new ways of realizing a justice in this land. And so, Carmen, por favor, tienes la palabra.
Gracias, compadre. Buenos días, o buenas tardes, o buenas noches, depending on your time zones. It's a privilege to be here, and thanks to the technologies that make us incarnate to and with each other beyond distance. It's no surprise that a social encyclical has emerged from Pope Francis at this time. While we may be expecting one in 2021 for the 120th anniversary of Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, the Pope's reflections in Fratelli, Tutti on solidarity, belonging, and kinship at this time demonstrate the purpose of Catholic social teaching, theological and pastoral responses to the signs of the times as they happen in real time. And not only the joys and the hopes, but as Gaudium et Spes reminds us, the grief and anxieties, especially of those who are poor and afflicted in any way. For Francis, the pandemic functions in at least three ways. First, it is a sign of our times in lo cotidiano, in our daily lived experience. Second, it is a locus theologicus, a legitimate place and source of theologizing. Third, it serves as a metaphor for intersecting social injustices that the virus continues to unveil, exacerbate, and illuminate. What Francisco writes, the content, is also not a surprise. Hermandad, our relationships with each other and creation as siblings and as kin, is an ongoing refrain of this pontificate. He turns to St. Francis of Assisi, who recognized hermandad, relationships as brothers and sisters, not only among humans, from the friars who chose poverty to those who suffered it as a socioeconomic cruelty, but hermandad with Mother, Sister Earth, brothers, wind and fire, sister water, and even sister death. From my perspective as a Latino theologian from the United States, I want to raise two observations that I find compelling, and I frame them with the Pope's own words. Observation number one can be found in section number 135. Quote, Latino culture is a ferment of values and possibilities that can greatly enrich the United States, end quote. Pope Francis sees us Latinos, and he gives us a global shout out. Nuestras comunidades are not invisible to him, despite constant attempts by state and even church to erase memory of our complicated past, to control our expanding present and presence, and to limit our future with walls, negligence, and hateful rhetoric that threatens our very existence. Throughout this encyclical, Francis challenges universalizing attempts that seek uniformity at the expense of differences, which sacrifice the uniqueness of individuals, peoples, and cultures for the sake of faux unity. El sabor local, what Francis calls the local flavor as lived in the USA, is not and never has been a monochromatic, monolingual, or monotone experience, and appeals to national unity cannot be erased cannot be based in any kind of erasure of the cacophony of cultures and peoples that call this place our native land. For Francisco, universal does not mean, quote, bland, uniform, and standardized, based on a single prevailing cultural model, for this will ultimately lead to the loss of a rich palette of shades and colors and result in utter monotony, end quote, section 144. While monotony may well be a state of calm that we crave after 4 tumultuous years of a president who has catered to monochromatic nationalism and xenophobia, universalizing MAGA, Make America Great, is inconsistent with and antithetical to the very Catholic vision laid out in this encyclical, a vision that has already been pointed out by our brother Bishop that is consistent with the teachings of his predecessors. Francis addresses a loss of historical consciousness within the context of cultural colonization. It is not really a great leap to see MAGA reflected in what Francis describes as ideologies that destroy differences, intentionally erase memories, foment violence, rob the soul, weaken critical thinking, and manipulate treasured concepts and great words to, quote, serve as tools for domination, as meaningless tags that can be used to justify any action, end quote, section 14. My second observation, I would like to frame in terms of section 19 and his very distinctive phrase, quote, they did not have to die that way, end quote. With these haunting words, Francis slams down any excuses for inadequate responses to this pandemic. The consequences are a result of systemic inequities and social malpractice that disproportionately impact the most vulnerable among us, locally, nationally, and globally. These very same words apply as well to the consequences of racism and poverty. This insight is underscored by the juxtaposition of these words in the section subtitled A Throwaway World, numbers 18 through 21. Those deemed most disposable, as determined by age, disability, race, socioeconomic status, are victimized not only by COVID-19, they are ravaged by this impact of systemic social viruses that a lived solidarity could cure if humans chose to recognize and live a shared hermandad. George Floyd and Breonna Taylor did not have to die that way. Migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert and the Mediterranean Sea did not have to die that way. Over 1 million abuelas y abuelos, neighbors, acquaintances, strangers worldwide, and mi amigo Richard Guastella did not have to die that way. This is not a post-pandemic encyclical. It is written from in the midst of human and creation's misery, with expectations that to survive it, we need to act in solidarity now. And we must continue to cultivate these relationships and the changes they demand once COVID-19 is long gone. Why? Porque this virus is not the only threat to our hermandad, to our shared creatureliness, and to our belonging to each other. Gracias.
Gracias, Carmen. I think that was a home run, as we would say, right? That was great. Thank you, Carmen. And what I'd like to do now is to lift up a few elements that I heard from each of you, and then give you an opportunity, give the panel an opportunity to begin this conversation. Again, this is something that is intended to engage not only the panelists, but really to engage all of you who are participating. And so I strongly encourage you to send in some questions. The questions are being received. And so the next part of this conversation will be, with one another here in the panel, but also with you. And so let me begin to see if we can continue to dream together now as a group. And here are some things that I heard from our distinguished panelists. And so I heard from Bishop Stoll this wonderful image of bridge building that is not limited to a single individual, but rather needs to really extend outward. So it's almost like it's not an almost, I was in fact hearing the social nature of the self, in the social nature of our human activity, that in fact calls us to not just simply help those that are in our families, those that are in our churches, those that are in our synagogues, places of worship, et cetera, those that are even in our nation. And this is why I think that the kind of mentality that wants to say we put America first over and against the rest of the world is profoundly flawed from this kind of Catholic understanding of the social constitution of selves, nations, peoples. And so I love that image of a bridge that is constructed not simply by an individual, but really to create a bridge to where everybody can benefit. And then from Dr. Sean Copeland, I just absolutely loved her exploration with the word horizon, and then this playfulness, and in fact the way in which she wrestled and as well as put together, conjugated the dignity and indignant. And so I thought that was that offers us a lot of resources to dream together, lots of food for thought in that image. From John, among the various critiques in terms of the social, economic, and political dimensions that many nations, including our own, is experiencing. I also liked the way that he points out how this papacy is really creating a bridge. Again, this was echoing Bishop Stowe's own presentation, but creating a bridge between doctrine and experience, something that Latino theologians, among others, have been really doing ever since this theology came into being over 30 years ago. The need to relate praxis and theory, the need to relate praxis to lo cotidiano. And in that sense, Carmen Nanco Fernandez invites us and invited us, really invited us to think and rethink the signs of the times, but not simply in an abstract way, but really the signs of the times as we live them today. And so theologizing out of real life experiences, out of real time. It is fascinating that perhaps the work of grace and the work of the Spirit was at work here, because all of us touched upon those the expression, the signs of the times in one way or the other. And this is again something that we have we have drawn from the documents of the Second Vatican Council, and have grown to appreciate that quote that is oftentimes we've heard it so many times. I've had it up in one of my slides. And so what I'd like us to do now is to just turn it over to our distinguished panelists and see. That's what I heard. That's not the only thing I heard from each of you, but those are some of the elements that caught my attention. I like you to engage one another as we begin to take some questions too, and I'll intersperse. I'll draw from those questions that I'll get and continue this conversation. Anyone would like to? Let's begin with Bishop Stowe.
Yeah, thank you for putting it together so nicely. I really hear the contrast between the building of bridges and the building of walls. And Pope Francis has mentioned that before. And what I heard from Dr. Copeland was very interesting too, and it stuck out to me in the encyclical, that the walls are not just between nations, but even on your same side of the wall, how we can create exiles, how we can discount people. And I just think about when our bishops' conference puts out a voting document, how much better it could have been if we had started with human dignity as the preeminent issue. And what do we do to human beings at every stage of life, from every race of life, from every background, and who is about building bridges in this political cycle? I think we'd have a whole different kind of discourse, at least among ourselves. I don't know how it would relate to society, but it gives us something to begin with, building bridges.
Dr. Copeland, would you like to respond, since your image has come up?
Certainly, because I think the notion of dignity resonated through all of the presentations in different ways. Dr. Nanco Fernandez, in really reiterating, didn't have to die this way, is a clear challenge to our inability to see others as our brothers and sisters. And the Pope is really very, very clear on this. And he uses that phrase, brothers and sisters, throughout. The other point that he's making here, to say, he makes this point very clear, that in paragraph 23, that the organizations of societies worldwide is still far from reflecting clearly that women possess the same dignity and identical rights as men. I'm not expecting from this Pope a feminist manifesto. I'm not expecting it, and I'm not criticizing him for not having it. But the point is, he's doing what he can, as he can in his own character, to remind us that we are all related as brothers and sisters. And yes, we can turn those words back on him. Yes, you can turn paragraph 23 right back at him. But the fact of the matter, the way that women are being treated in the United States is very interesting. Just as a little concern about women's dignity here. We have in the highest office of the land someone who has profound disrespect for women, and who has shown that disrespect in very public ways, thinking that you can do what you will. But here he's trying to say that we say with one thing with words, but our decisions and reality. So pay attention to what we do. How do we behave? This is really, I think, quite crucial, particularly in terms of dignity. Dignity is innate. It is inalienable, intrinsic. And yes, it is the height of indignity to reject those who are prevented from living and developing integrally. He reminds us the world exists for everyone, because all of us were born with the same dignity. Difference is not a barrier to human dignity, nor is some form of debility or some form of limitation. So I find this extraordinary, and I find it also like drinking from a water hose. There's just so much here. There's just so much here to parse. I mean, theologians are going to have a field day with this, I think, for the next maybe 5-10 years. But certainly these images that relate to part of what Professor Nanco Fernandez said, existential foreigners and hidden exiles, the elderly who are hidden from us, and they are outcast and exiled from our company, and existential foreigners, those whom we abandon or ignore, even though they are here in the same country, is really, it's incredible. Racism is I just used this expression myself before I read the encyclical, racism as a virus, the twin pandemics with which we are struggling in the United States, these outbreaks, and it does mutate. It doesn't disappear. And we're seeing it rear its ugly head here and around the world. and around the world. In that same shout out, and I'll stop, to Latinos that, that Dr. Nanco Fernandez pointed out, is a reminder of the presence and influence and profound contribution of Jews to Argentinian culture. And I think in a point where anti-Semitism really has reared its ugly head in the United States, this is a profound point for us to pay attention to. We need to pay attention to that. We can't forget, and the Pope reminds us that Jesus himself is Jewish a few times in this encyclical. So, I mean, I appreciate all that I've heard, and I'm eager to hear from others, but truly, this is really an exciting opportunity for me. I really feel privileged in this way to be here. It's not a presumed privilege either, and it's not earned. I think it's purely gratuitous.
Yeah, I really appreciated Bishop Stowe's point too about how in the past Catholic neocons on the right have either ignored or distorted papal teaching on economic justice. I think that's really significant. You know, Pope John Paul II and Benedict had similar critiques of the market system that neocons on the right didn't have much to say about or completely distorted. And I think like one thing I've seen is, you know, sort of the loudest voices for MAGA Catholicism, if you want to put it that way, have been very quiet about this encyclical. And I think because what the Pope is talking about here in terms of knocking down border walls, dismantling a free market fundamentalist system, that does not dovetail well with their political and ideological goals. So the silence of the Catholic right is disappointing on this, but perhaps expected. And I did really appreciate Dr. Fernandez pointing to that very haunting line that we've all talked about in terms of they did not have to die that way. I'm sure many of you may have seen the New York Times article just the other day with the headline, 8 million have slipped into poverty since May as federal aid has dried up. And if you read that story, it's just heartbreaking. And I've had a chance to talk to a Catholic sister in Chicago who works with, Boston, who works with COVID patients, and just the anguish of spiritually accompanying someone via video and trying to sort of, you know, be a presence in that situation is just so difficult. And we all know we're living in a time when COVID has really underscored and exacerbated how much income inequality and poverty are pro-life issues. You know, these are life and death choices that people are making right now between paying rent and buying food. And the Pope speaks into that very stark reality and says, we have to do this differently. And if we don't do this differently, we're missing an opportunity. He talks about hope too in the midst of this, and he points to the first responders and those that we've all seen out there on the front line. So amidst the darkness that he is speaking into, he's also pointing to the real moral heroes who are already out there doing this work. And I think that's something that we can draw inspiration from. I think just the last point I would make is how he connects this idea of a throwaway culture, which he's talked about so often, with the COVID pandemic. And he particularly connects this also to not only the elderly, which he has several paragraphs talking about that and how we've already discarded the elderly before this, but then he connects it to economic justice when he says, the way of discarding others can take a variety of forms, such as an obsession with reducing labor costs with no concern for its grave consequences, since the unemployment that it directly generates leads to the expansion of poverty. You know, we see people benefiting from this pandemic. I mean, you think about corporations like Amazon and others who are raking in billions while their own workers are protesting in front of the CEO's house. So into this stark reality, I think the Pope offers both a challenging critique to us to build something new, and also points us in a way of hope to those heroes who are out there and showing us in their daily life how to build something new.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Dr. Michael Murphy to jump in here in our conversation, and then we'll go to Carmen. I just want to say one small thing here. I think that we are all in many ways have and this goes to Carmen's point of theologizing in real time. Last night, I delivered this keynote at LMU, and the title of it was Viruses Target the Vulnerable and Know No Borders, Social Responsibility and Our Vote as Catholics. And I heard just Dr. Copeland mention herself using this image of viruses. I cannot help but to think how, in fact, we have been so made so conscious. We cannot but be consciously aware of this pandemic and the effects that it's had on our personal lives, on our professional lives, on our human interactions. And my hope is that that it truly opens our hearts and minds to the suffering of others, that we are able to, emerge from this horrible virus, better human beings that are capable of truly building bridges rather than walls. So with that in mind, Dr. Murphy, and then we'll go to Carmen, what do you find enriching in this streaming that is occurring among our panelists?
Thank you, Dr. Diaz. I'm just bathing and luxuriating in the wisdom that I'm hearing from the panelists, and just thinking about things. So I'll also have an eye on the questions. And so, John Gehring just spoke about certain issues that we're hearing resonances with the questions: disposable culture, and then the silence of the so-called, are they neocon Catholics? We're getting questions about those kinds of things. They're my questions as well. Dr. Copeland's insight moves me deeply, and it inspires me, it recalls me to Pope Francis's, the main things he began with in his papacy, when he said that diversity is a gift of the Holy Spirit, and division is from the devil. And he was not being metaphorical with that. And the stakes are very high for things like that. I think that's where I'm at. Personally, I'm still working my way through the Encyclical, and I think Dr. Copeland said this as well. This is going to be a 10-year more, but we have to inhabit it, So I will leave it there. Would you want me to list any questions now or later? I'm grouping.
So let's go. Let's have Carmen respond to the other panelists, and then let's take you be the question keeper, and then give us one question from our participants. Carmen, would you please continue our dreaming?
Just a couple of observations. Also, when listening to our conversation, I laughed when my good friend Sean Copeland said about it's like drinking from a garden hose. It's like drowning in the pool while the garden hose is still on in so many ways, and it'll take a lifetime to sort through. But I guess I have two insights on that. One is that when I read and watch Pope Francis, and especially read what at least the scholars would call his major works. I would propose that Francis writes in hyperlinks. So for everything that he says, it's a hyperlink to something else. It's almost like reading graphic novels. The box is only so small that you can get something in, and that artist knows that. So if you want to pursue this, you click and you keep going, and there's another whole textured world behind that. So you want to follow the hyperlink, go follow the hyperlink to the 1962 song that he points out, which is a Brazilian samba. I'll leave that to you. But I think that in that world, he's not just, and he's also telling you and me that he's hyperlinking to himself, because everything that is in these 92 pages is not brand new. He has been saying it since the day he asked us for his blessing on the balcony. He has said it in his daily homilies. He has said it in every audience, whether he's meeting with the Red Cross International or he's meeting with the Brazilian soccer team or the Argentinian local team. That's the love of his heart. He says it at every single gathering, whether he's meeting with people with disabilities or sharing a sandwich with elders or having time at the table with migrants. Besides John Paul II, he's probably the most documented pope in history. And what I mean by that is John Paul is documented in the big ways, but Francis is documented in what I would call the the popular catechesis. He's documented through his preaching, through those, all throughout the pandemic, we were getting Wednesday audiences. And if you read those Wednesday audiences, you're reading the popular version or the graphic novel version of Fratelli Tutti. So in that sense, I think what he's doing is like, okay, scholars, you weren't paying attention to that stuff, so I'm going to put it in a language you want to understand, a Catholic encyclical. Are you happy now? Enjoy. Don't forget to hit the footnotes, and don't forget to hit the hyperlinks. The second thing that I also think he's doing, and again, I have to go back and read this 300 more times, is I think he's pushing what dignity is beyond what we think it is. I think he thinks we've taken dignity for granted. There's a curious little question pops up right after in the disposable people section and right before the are we really having human rights section. I think it's number 23, where he says, let's talk more about equality of rights grounded in innate human dignity. I think he's saying is like, what does this even mean? Because if we're looking at the quality of the rights, it's abundantly clear you folks do not believe in innate human dignity. And where I think he's pushing it even further, which is going to give theologians and ethicists a lifetime of things to consider, is I think he's trying to add another dimension to dignity that comes out of his very Latino cultural background. And that is that notion of hermandad, that dignity is not just an individual concept, that each of us individually bears the divine image and can also disrespect that divine image in the way we behave, but that's collective. And that's lived, that dignity is lived when we truly understand ourselves as kin, as siblings, hermanos y hermanas, hermaneques, to each other and to the creation. And I think that's an advance. That's like pushing something that's kind of in social teaching, but has not really been picked up, especially within the context of the United States, because we conceptualize rights language and responsibilities language in individual terms. And that plays out in our elections, as John and Bishop John Stowe have both mentioned the political dimensions of things. And I guess the third thought I have is I go back to Sean Copeland, is she brings in the voice of our brother James Cone, that if you're looking at Francis, to paraphrase, what you are looking at is what love looks like in public. Love looks like in public. I would say we're looking at what love looks like in public theologizing. And he doesn't just do it with his words. He does it with his actions, his performances. And even if you look at his footnotes, for example, number 135 is not the only reference to Latinos in that document. Go look at the footnotes. The documents he quotes, when he's using, things he said in different places of the world, he is quoting the religious liberty, all that universalizing stuff, that comes from his quotations to the gathering of Hispanics and immigrants in 2015 in Philadelphia. And the topic was religious liberty. So in one move, with a footnote and a quote, he is telling you that the most important thing he said in the United States, you better go back and read Philadelphia 2015, because he explodes religious liberty and how people in the United States want to understand that. And I would emphasize again what our brother Bishop says too, is that I'm not really sure that at least our U.S. Bishop conferences get him, because I think we're spending more time in the United States pushing against him as opposed to being open. But those are just some thoughts in listening to what folks had to say.
Thank you, Carmen. As you were speaking again, we haven't yet brought up explicitly because I do think that it runs throughout the whole document, the biblical parable, right, that he uses of the Good Samaritan, and it runs throughout the encyclical. And to borrow from what you and Dr. Copeland, as well as Bishop as Bishop Stowe, as well as John have been highlighting, there are concrete implications to how we love the forgotten, the marginalized. This is not an abstract neighbor, and it's certainly also not in this encyclical a kind of love that is to be just individually practiced. And so here again we go back to Bishop Stowe's comments that about the bridge building that welcomes others to use it. It really is a wonderful way for the Pope to really socialize in some ways, the parable of the Good Samaritan, because it is really calling us to go beyond the kind of simply, well, we accept someone or we love someone. No, and I think you're onto something in terms of this notion of exploding the understanding of human dignity, and rejecting all of our practices that treat persons less than full siblings in the household of God. Michael, do you have a question for all of us that we can entertain at this point?
I do, and if you'll forgive me, I want to make one observation and then a clarification, then give you actually 4 or 5 questions. Absolutely. That are so we can get more voices involved. So the observation is to thank Dr. Nanco Fernandez. The image out of the Vatican in the early days of COVID, Pope Francis praying to an empty St. Peter's Square is resonant with me. It's prayer, it's poetry, it's witness. The clarification is a correction on your book, Miguel, and on the series. And I say con permiso, una pregunta para mí, a donde va con tanta prisa, right? The book is this, The Word Made Culture, that's Miguel's book, with a foreword by Cardinal Ravasi. It's the first in a series of which Professora Nanco Fernandez and Dr. Riebe Estrella, the series has got a fantastic name, Disruptive Cartographers Doing Theology Latinamente. So I wanted to say that before I give you a grouping of questions. And here they are from James Flynn. He says, I think the walls that are obvious inside the Catholic Church are there. How deep and how high they are. From Tom Horvath, will the American hierarchy finally listen to this Pope? Or are most of them actually schismatic? So speakers, jot down some ideas as I read these off. I have a couple more. This is from our colleague at Loyola, Naomi Fisher, in philosophy, a general question. She says, maybe for John Gehring, does this, quote, new kind of politics require of us a different way of interacting or loving our political opponents? Finally, this other group from David Stosur, I would enjoy hearing their thoughts, the panelists' thoughts, on the implications of Fratelli Tutti for the churches in the US. And last one in that grouping, these are quite literally parochial questions. It's from Mary Carey. How do we educate parish priests about good voting conscience in the broad spectrum? So I'll leave it there for Miguel, you to unpack these, and as you will.
Yeah, so actually the questions are excellent because they continue to invite us to theologize in real time, right? And with real persons and concrete experiences. So I'd like to open it up to any of the panelists to, so the questions have to do with, to listening to the Pope, to how big are the walls, to loving those outside of our political circles, to all kinds of ways of engaging religious leaders, priests, etc. So what would you like to, which of those questions would any of you like to address?
Miguel, I can put that together with something that John Gehring said a little bit earlier about the MAGA Catholics, because another thing that Pope Francis addresses here is our inability to communicate right now. And in one place, he talks about our hyper-connectedness, and yet we're still alone.
Yes.
And yet we're still alone. And I think it's the breakdown in ability to communicate. And Pope Francis, as Dr. Nanco Fernandez has been saying this all along, that we have to have this culture of encounter. And I remember early on, he said, you can't have an encounter with a device that you turn on and off, right? But with our ability now to use Twitter to get our points across and not have to listen to what anybody else says, the echo chambers that we create for ourselves and only hearing those who want to, why we're not hearing much from the so-called MAGA Catholics about this encyclical. I think it goes back to what I said about Francis drawing it all together. There's nothing for them to react to explicitly because it's all connected together and you throw out the whole thing. And I think that's why there is such an anti-Francis sentiment in the church in the United States. Unfortunately, you see it even in the bishops' conference. The walls are there and we're not permeating the walls, even though we have digital means of communicating.
So what is, does anybody have any recipes for success here? It really is almost like a diplomatic need and activity in our own country. You know, when I was serving the United States and we were dealing with all these issues at the international level, I many times, because of everything that was going on back home, I would think, my goodness, it seems like we need our own diplomatic corps in the United States to begin to tear down those walls. You remember the famous speech by Obama in terms of Berlin, tearing down the walls and building bridges. Of course, you know, diplomats do that at the international level, but it seems like before we can do that kind of work internationally, we have to begin right here at home. And so I ask, you know, my fellow panelists, you know, in light of what Bishop Stoll just said, in terms of these walls, in light of the questions that we've been raised in terms of political, religious leaders, et cetera, what can we do to begin to foster this kind of encounter, listening that Pope Francis is calling for, if we have a significant number of Catholics that are not even going to read the encyclical or really engage it and take it seriously, because they're going to just dismiss it as, oh, well, this is coming from, you fill in the blank. Anyone want to comment on that?
I'll jump in. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about is, and Pope Francis addresses this in the encyclical, I mean, we live in a very crude political moment. He's got a quote in the encyclical where he says, "Things that until a few years ago could not be said by anyone without risking the loss of universal respect can now be said with impunity and in the crudest of terms, even by some political figures." So I think, you know, we exist in an environment that we all are sort of in our own echo chambers, particularly on social media. I think one development that is very difficult, and Miguel, to go back to your point, maybe this is sort of a diplomatic question. I don't know how to deal with it, and this is not to cast aspersions over all bishops, because I think actually most bishops are trying their very best to speak in a very difficult political environment. But, you know, I spend probably too much time on Twitter, which is not good for my spiritual and mental health. But we have a lot of loud bishops on Twitter who have these digital pulpits. And it's just incredibly irresponsible behavior that you see from some of these bishops who are really almost auditioning for sort of like a Fox News network. They're not being pastors on Twitter. And I only bring that up because connecting it to the quote that Pope Francis talked about, we see this nastiness in our own church. And look, some of this happens on the left and right. I don't want to put it all on a particular side, but getting back to one of the questions that Michael Murphy asked in terms of how do we love our political opponents, I do think having spiritual and political humility is really important. And that's just a starting point that I think we all have to lean into. Where I struggle with is this important idea of civility being very, very critical. However, I do think sometimes the nods to civility can kind of be used to quiet us down and say, let's not speak truth to power right now, and let's not raise uncomfortable issues about racism or sexism or misogyny or how we treat LGBTQ plus people. So how do we speak truth to power, but do it in a way of love? That is a very difficult one. I don't have the answer for that, but I think we have to hold those two things in tension. And look, we all experience this in our own families. We have people who perhaps in our own family we share a faith with, but we have dramatically different political views, and we all wrestle with this in our daily life, and there's nothing easy about it.
Yeah, thank you, John, because I do think that bringing it down even to that basic level, you know, that we do all wrestle with this in our daily life. I was wrestling with this week with my Cuban parents in Miami. And so, you know, these are real life issues, and they're stressing us all out because precisely they deal with familial ties. They deal with our faith. They deal with issues that really have shaped and informed our human identities for a very long time. And it's sort of like having that kind of well, I love this part of it. I really, I'm really upset about this. And so, Carmen and Sean, you want to jump in here and offer us your wisdom?
I don't know that I have wisdom, but I think about these topics that the Pope is writing about in terms of political theology, and I keep trying to do this, not involved in partisan politics, but by taking a comprehensive view. And so, this is partly why I love this encyclical so much. I'm not a big fan of encyclicals. I like Popolorum Progressio a lot, but this is really bracing. One of the points I just want to make quickly is about the parable. He talks about a stranger on the road. Mm-hmm. So it's not an identified. He parables the parable in this way, or does a kind of midrash, if you will, using that word loosely, on the parable. And one of the things that Amy Jill Levine, who is a Jewish New Testament scholar at Vanderbilt, she takes that parable in The Misunderstood Jew, her book on Jesus, and she says one of the key interpretations that she really finds valuable is that of Martin Luther King Jr., who says, don't cast blame or criticism constantly on the priest or the Levite. One of the things that's happening for them is that they're concerned about themselves, and so are we. So we develop a kind of indifference. Here's the root of our hidden exiles. Here's the root of our existential foreigners. We become indifferent to one another. And I think this is one of the pushes that's coming through here, not to be indifferent, not to objectify the other, whoever that is. Right after that paragraph 23 that Carmen mentioned earlier, 24, he talks about trafficking. He talks about the deprivation of freedom of children, women, and men, millions. And it's this tendency to objectify, to be indifference. And that's akin in a certain way to tolerance, mere tolerance. Right. So anything can go on as long as, I just keep going. I don't have to speak truth to power. I can just keep going because I'm okay. And here's the critique of individualism. Here's the desire for sharing perspectives, I think. So I'm just, the anthropology that's here that I would love to try to tease out in more depth is really fascinating to me, because it's an insistence on caring. It's an insistence on active love, on compassion. It's a rejection of individualism at every level. It's a rejection of indifference.
Which, of course, has been one of the central themes of his papacy, right? The globalization of human indifference that he has again and again and again rejected, beginning with his trip to the island of Lampedusa, and they're beginning to say, how could we call ourselves Christians and act this way? So it really is a consistent theme of this papacy. Carmen?
Yeah, I get going back to some of the questions that were asked in terms of the church and even the church in the US. I think part of what happens with Francis is that what I call is Francis has been Latinoized. In other words, he gets the same treatment the rest of us do in the United States who are Latinos. We ain't that smart. We like to sing, we like to dance, but we're pastoral, but we're not theological. And he gets that all the time. He got that in the United States. His English has an accent. He's not a theologian, but he's pastoral. And even in the pages of Commonweal this past week, this isn't theology, it's psychology and spirituality. Seriously? So I guess I have to sit there and say is, why can the bishops and the scholars not take him seriously? Because he's basically being told that what he's doing is not theology, so we don't have to listen. But it's cute and it's nice. At the same time, so I think that's one of the problems. At the same time, I guess I think is that what he is saying does speak to folks, because it's all based on stuff that he has said to folks at the most practical pastoral level that you have. The audience, the sermon, the sitting around at meals. And he's done that and he said that, and he's highly accessible. So maybe the places to begin might be with his footnotes that take you to the original place that he said some of these things, and that maybe don't go quite as long as 92 pages. But I think to not believe that our people are capable of understanding their own lived realities, even if they don't agree with the Pope, is to insult our very own people of faith, because in many ways, he's the abuelo en nuestra fe. He's our grandfather in the faith for many of us who's taken a very accompanying role. Somebody asked a very practical question about, well, how does this look in politics? I could be having this wrong, and if so, I apologize in advance. But I think it was the network, the Catholic Lobby Group network, who put out a voter guide based on Francis. So, like, you know, there's several voter guides. And I also want to give a shout out to Bishop Stowe, because there are bishops who know how to use communications. My pushback on Francis is that he really doesn't quite yet comprehend the power of the media that has allowed us to be incarnational in a time of social distance. Without it, some people didn't necessarily die alone thanks to the iPad or a telephone. We're sitting here with 300 people, most of us who don't know each other, and names that I'm seeing like, oh my God, I read them in graduate school, that I would never have been in the same room with. You know, I follow Bishop Stowe on Twitter. I see John Gehring's work, but I would never have seen them face to face if not for opportunities like this. Miguel and I are across town from each other. We haven't seen each other since the first week of March. We live like less than half an hour from each other. So I think at some level, what I would have liked to have seen in Francis, and what I think is maybe our work to pursue, is how does the responsible use of these technologies that makes us present, allows us to accompany, allows us to worship together, allows us to go to school across the globe. We have students in like 17 time zones in our classes right now. How does that cause us to think about another dimension of what Sean raised before, what it means to be human? How is that got to be entered into our theologizing about human anthropology as we understand it in theological terms?
Thank you, Carmen. So, Michael, we're running close to our time here. It's really unfortunate because this is such a rich discussion. But why don't we take a few more questions, and then we'll take about maybe 3-4 more minutes the most to address those, and then we'll wrap this this excellent conversation. And I hope that this is really the springboard for more conversations like this across the country, in our own communities, in our own universities, in our own parishes, so that we can really engage one another, and above all, beyond engaging, love one another. So, Michael, what can you give us a couple more questions that we might be able to, to use as a way to synthesize this rich discussion?
I'll try. I'll say one thing, Dr. Nanco Fernandez. I say that's the secret sauce. Read the footnotes first, people. You'll I see heads nodding there. There's a great question. This might be for Carmen again. Her article in Commonweal. Yes. The title of the Encyclical has some gender trouble, and maybe unpack some of that. But that could be long. But let me just read one more question from Patricia Robinson. I think this is worth the last question. Here in the U.S., so many in the clergy hierarchy exert political pressure through rote fear-mongering against so-called socialism in response to any mobilization towards social justice activism. They thus block any reasonable discussion of democratic socialist solutions, while implying that only laissez-faire capitalism is the so-called Catholic view. How should one go about overcoming that sort of bullying by dogmatic Pope quoting from other eras? I would just add that to me scandalizes the Holy Spirit in some way. But that's what we have, Miguel.
Yeah, those are two excellent questions. I think that maybe on Carmen's question, Carmen can just make reference to the excellent article that she published on Commonweal, because it does address that question of gender, and Carmen, and I'll let Carmen briefly speak to that. But let's take the second question, which I think is really really challenging for all of us, and for Catholic leaders, for bishops. How do we deal with this? How do we deal with this mentality that all of a sudden that you issue the word social? It's almost like Catholic social teaching becomes a bad word. If it was the best kept secret before, now it's the bad word secret, or I don't know how to phrase that, but in fact has become something so negatively associated with the political world, that even that is at risk of not being able to be engaged. And so I don't know if it's certainly I don't want to put our brother bishop on the spot here, but anyone, including Bishop Stowe, want to comment on that? Because I think that is a very good question.
It sounds like a lot of the emails and messages that I get calling me a socialist, but I think it's a real failure in our theological formation, what happens in seminaries. If we don't see the social teaching of the church as integral, the way Pope Francis does, and it's seen as an optional or a specialization in theology, then it's not going to get the attention or be integrated to what's real theology. I think that was how they distorted the encyclicals of the previous popes. They took out what was really theology from the other stuff. I heard it said here again earlier here, as Dr. Naco Fernandez said about what makes something real theology, and how can this not be? It's also ignorance of history. I mean, look at the influence of Catholic social teaching on social democratic parties in Europe. They were called social democratic parties for a reason, and they were based in, had a strong influence from Catholic social teaching. So it's ignorance of history and part of the fear mongering that the Pope addresses it in paragraph 15, fear mongering as a political tool.
On that note, I think that I see that Carmen sent around the link to her excellent piece that deals with some of these issues related to the translation of Fratelli into English. And I encourage all of you who have participated in this webinar Zoom meeting today to read her excellent piece. And I really want to take this, and I'll give it over to, hand it over to Michael. But before I do so, I really want to take this opportunity to thank, from the bottom of my heart, Bishop Stowe, my good friends, John, Carmen, and Sean, for really participating in this necessary discussion at this time in our nation's history. And really continue to, I offer the invitation to each one of us to continue to dream together of a better nation, of a more perfect union, because in fact, we are desperately in need of new models of relating and new models of interacting with one another that humanize us. Because if we are in fact losing the soul of America, it is because we have really failed miserably to encounter one another, to listen to each other's stories, to accept one another's humanity, our weaknesses as well as our strengths, and to build upon one another, a better society. And so profoundly grateful to each of you for having joined the Hank Center, profoundly thankful for Commonweal for the sponsorship. And of course, I'll hand it over to my colleague and friend, Michael. And thank you, Michael.
Thank you. I offer a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you for all on the screens, on our Brady Bunch screens, for clapping your hands. I don't have anything to add. Miguel, thank you. It's been a delight to work with you. I want to thank our panelists for just quickly accepting our invitation. I usually close with a poem, and I just say, let our lives be poems. Let our lives be poems of justice, as always, and beauty, and truth, and goodness. So I would just say that. Thanks again, and take good care, everybody.